Matissimo, top, Toledo.
I don't know about you, but I wanna be happy today.
Me too, my brother.
Wake up in the morning, feel real motivated, oh yeah. Everything in life is better with a smile on your face.
Al Chile.
Everything in life is better if you're happy, my friend. Do one time for the music tonight.
Toledo again.
You got it.
Where they are, yo. Yo, kick it off, Rick.
I don't know about you, but I wanna be happy today.
Happy today.
And wake up in the morning, feel real motivated, oh yeah.
Rated, oh yeah.
Everything in life is better with a smile on your face.
Everything happy be better.
Everything in life is better if you're happy, my friend. So be happy, yeah, along the way. And pray for a better day. Keep praying, me friend. So be happy, yeah, along the way. And pray for a better day. Keep praying, me friend.
Ok, una sonrisa me motiva demasiado. Vivir feliz es algo tan que he logrado. No publicar que estoy feliz en mis estados, sino agradecer lo que el Señor me ha enviado. Another happy day, another smile, another sunny day with other styles. Some more blessings sent from another mile. One love, one heart, that's how we profile.
So be happy, yeah, along the way. And pray for a better day. Keep praying, me friend. So be happy, yeah, along the way. And pray for a better day. Keep praying, me friend.
God have mercy. Me know what me in, me no know what you in, pero la felicidad me causa adrenalina. Celebremos por la vida, celebremos por el día, celebremos porque la felicidad no termina. El diablo nos ataca, pero Dios nos domina. Pura vida, a los compas de la esquina una sonrisa. Es la medicina, vitamina, me fascina, eso sí me ilumina.
So be happy, yeah, along the way. And pray for a better day. Keep praying, me friend. So be happy, yeah, along the way. And pray for a better day. Keep praying, me friend.
My name is Melissa Chan. Thanks for joining us both in person and online. This fireside chat is titled From Grassroots to Global, Protecting the Planet in the Digital Age. And Paula Ricarte, Associate Professor at the Department of Media and Digital Culture at Tecnológico de Monterrey, will be facilitating this chat. Quick introduction about Paula. She founded Tierra Común, a network of academics and activists looking at decolonizing data. She's also attached to the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, serves on expert committees, including the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, and is a member of the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, as well as the Feminist AI Research Network. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Paula Ricarte, and I'm very grateful to be here. Today we are delighted to have a conversation with our very special guest, Irene Khan and Vilas Dar. And if you are joining us online or here in the setting, please send your questions and comments through the app. You have to scan your QR code, and then go to Stage Resources and send your questions through the Q&A application. So first, I'm going to introduce our very special guest. Irene Khan is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right of freedom of opinion and expression since August 1st, 2020. She is the first woman to hold this position since the establishment of the mandate in 1993. She is a former Secretary General of Amnesty International and an internationally recognized advocate for human rights, gender equality, and social justice. Welcome, Irene. It's a pleasure to have you here. Vilas Dar is President and Trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a $1.5 billion 21st century philanthropy advancing artificial intelligence and data solutions to create a thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all. Under his leadership, the foundation bridges technological innovation and social impact with a commitment to justice and equity. Vilas is an entrepreneur, technologist, and human rights advocate with a lifelong commitment to creating more robust, human-centered social institutions. Welcome, Vilas. Thank you for being here. So, I'm going to take a seat first, and I will briefly introduce our conversation. And I would begin saying that discussions about the climate emergency are not always anchored in issues that are relevant to our community. Human rights, minorities, and technology are not necessarily placed together at the center of the discussion of the climate crisis. Yet we know that the climate crisis is also rooted in technological development and inequality. Our guests have approached the climate crisis from a critical and proactive perspective, making these connections visible, but also exploring ways to mitigate its effects. So, Irene has done an amazing job related to the safety of climate defenders, access to climate information, and exploring the role of misinformation, disinformation as an obstacle to mitigate the climate crisis. Vilas have been working on the role of women and girls as architects of solutions to the climate emergency, the opportunity to create shared data, infrastructure, and approaches to shift power to local communities. So let's begin with our first round of questions. Irene, in your forthcoming report to the Human Rights Council on Sustainable Development, you talk about the importance of voice of women, marginalized groups, and others. How do we ensure they have a voice in governance? What mechanisms are already in place, and how could they be better?
Well, thank you for asking that question, and thank you for inviting me to this chat. You know, voice is very important.
Are you unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Apologies, please.
Hello?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was saying that voice is absolutely essential, not only for sustainable development, but for sustaining development. I think that's the importance of it. And when we talk about women, for example, their challenge is to, first of all, be heard publicly through public participation, but also to be heard in their own communities and even in their own families. So what I'm saying is that this is a multifaceted problem, the importance of voice. And therefore, the social aspects need to be taken into account as well as the technological and legal and other aspects. Now, how do we get voices heard? Well, first of all, there has to be a commitment to it, a legal commitment, a human rights commitment. And there are some very impressive documents. For example, the Escazú Agreement, which is, of course, from the region where you are in Latin America. And that sets out very clear obligations for open, inclusive engagement. It recognizes environmental offenders as a category of people, as groups to be protected, and requires this kind of consultation to be part of any decision to be made in the context of environmental issues. There are, of course, also many multi-stakeholder initiatives that are coming up, very interesting, on extractives and fishing, on medicine, open government, for example, where the idea is that you bring all the stakeholders around the table and engage with them. And there's been some very interesting work done, for instance, by Corruption Watch in Indonesia, where they have worked with the government on the one side to improve online access to information and then build the capacity of users, of journalists, researchers, civil society to then access and use that information. So there are many different ways in which one can organize and build capacity, but we should not forget that there is a technological aspect of bringing in people, especially people at risk, vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, women, but there are also deep social factors that discriminate against them and that exclude them. So I think we have to work at both levels to break those barriers, but there is absolutely no doubt that their agency, their empowerment, their participation is critical if we are to deal with the problem of climate change.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. There is, well, it's a multifaceted problem, as you said. Vilas, in a recent piece in the WEF agenda, you made a case for investing in and centering women and girls as critical champions of climate solutions. Why are women and girls uniquely vulnerable to climate change? And what are the opportunities if we find new ways to support them?
Paula, thank you for the question, and I'm filled with gratitude and appreciation this morning. To you for moderating this panel, to RightsCon for bringing us together, and to you, Irene. I've followed your work for many years and have such appreciation for your leadership on human rights around the world. This question you asked, Paula, I think is the critical one. The fact that in a world in which we're all vulnerable to the effects of climate change, we have to recognize that the inequalities and the injustices of the world are magnified in times of significant crisis. There's plenty of data that demonstrates the adverse effects to vulnerable populations, to women and girls, the heightened risk of violence that women face at times of economic and social stress, a bad harvest in a village that leads to the fragmenting of the social culture, the access to safe healthcare that often suffers when economic criteria limit the ability to have money to spend on basic access. And we know that girls are often the first to ask school when families have to restrict and tighten their belts. But this isn't just a story about data, and it's not just a story about vulnerability. I'd share instead an experience I had recently. I was in Bhutan a few years ago, and as much time as I enjoyed with the Prime Minister in the capital, the thing that really stood out for me from that trip was a visit to a rural mountain village where we got to sit with a family and have a cup of the most welcome chai up in the blustery kind of mountains. And what was unique in this conversation with this family was a family that had farms, that were working on harvests, that were being affected certainly by climate change. And in that family, the responsibility for the financial safety and welfare of the entire family sat with a 13-year-old girl. She had the only cell phone in the family. She was the only one really literate and proficient with it. And the joy in her face as she showed me how she used the functions of the phone to manage the cash flow of the family, to know what price they were able to sell into the market, to be able to project how much cash they might have as they looked into the next season. Look, women and girls are critical to the social fabric, to the economic welfare of families. They are the ones at the front lines of many of the challenges that climate change is creating inside of villages and communities. And yet, we somehow leave them out of solution design and creation. If we look at the world of technology, we know that women and girls are vastly underrepresented across the entire workforce. Only about 22% of professionals identify as women. We know that in elected legislatures and political processes, women continue to be underrepresented. And we know that across policies, nearly 77% of countries lack laws ensuring equal land ownership rights for women. So in this context, one of both critical vulnerability, but also seeing how individuals step up to own the responsibilities for their families, we think there's a real opportunity here to bring women and girls not merely into the discourse, but to center them as architects of technological solutions that address the specific problems they face in their communities. Whether it's by helping turn climate data into insights that support community leaders to make decisions about things like when and how to plant and harvest, or when and how to sell into the market, thinking about empowering collaboration between all kinds of stakeholders, and we'll talk more about this hopefully through shared data infrastructure, and prioritizing and targeting what humanitarian relief should look like. Again, a role that traditionally women and girls have often occupied post-disaster to help secure the kinds of resources that allow for continuity in these communities. But doing this requires intention. And I think you'll see this as a through line through our comments today and probably through all of RightsCon, that defaults don't lead to justice that empowers the world. Instead, we need to make specific choices. We need to invest in digital literacy and the empowerment of young women and girls to have direct access to technology creation, literacy, and use. We need to build an ecosystem of ambitious organizations that bridge the gap between gender justice and climate justice, that let us understand that technological infrastructure can further these twin goals in equitable ways. And we need to figure out how to put women in more leadership and decision-making roles. From the perspective of a philanthropy and the perspective of civil society, it strikes me that these are the interventions that create global solutions that allow for human answers to global challenges. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you very much. Definitely, we need stakeholders to commit to this mission, because gender justice is aligned, is tied to environmental justice, as you said. Irene, as you were mentioning, there is a tight connection between the right to information and the climate crisis. As a special rapporteur, how do you see the right to information as an important issue for addressing climate change?
Well, of course, the right to information is absolutely essential to expose what I call the climate scandals, to put the information out about where we are going wrong. It is essential to advocate, to raise awareness, and very importantly, to change our behavior, whether it's government policy or whether it's community activities or individual behavior as well. So information is essential. Now, at one level, if you take the legal level, 90% of the world is now covered by countries that have right to information laws. But don't be fooled by that. Underneath it, what we find is that there are very broad, even in countries which have laws, there are very broad exemptions. For example, the United States is protected from revealing information about hazardous chemicals that it keeps on its own military sites, whether in the US or abroad. And that's absolutely essential information that communities need to have. Then there is the area, of course, of corporate responsibility for information. The UN guiding principles ask companies to be transparent. And there are some interesting initiatives that have been taken. For example, the African Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, which has actually led a number of African countries to introduce laws requiring companies to be transparent. There is the European Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, which also requires companies to report on various issues. There are 40 countries that have open registers in which information is there. But in practice, of course, companies do not produce sufficient information. Sometimes it's misleading, and clearly it's very often limited to precisely what they need to do under the law and get away with it. So And then, of course, data is hard to use. So it's really the weakness of the state in holding business to account. But there are other issues, too, that we need to consider when we think about access to information. Digital divide, for example. Access to the internet is a legal right in many countries, but almost 3 billion, 2.7 billion people in this world have no access or no meaningful connectivity to the internet. And if you look at the least developed countries, countries like Bhutan or Nepal that Vilas was mentioning, only 30%, a third of the population have access there. And then, there are other issues with zero-rated services and so on. And again, if you look at access, who has access and who doesn't, of course, there's much lower access among women because of their lower level of literacy, because of their poverty situation, because they don't have access. The cost issues are, of course, there. There's also time poverty on their side. So we talk about the right to information, but when you actually come to practical access, there are clearly limitations. And of course, there is the whole issue of access to information is also tied down with affordability in the digital age to the internet. Access to the internet is 30 times more expensive in the least developed countries of this world than they are in developed countries. And that is a reflection of the failure to invest sufficiently. That is about corporate greed, if I can put it crudely, that actually is making this world a very unequal world in the ability to access information. And yet without information, we do not know what is happening. We do not know how to change our own behaviors. We do not know how to engage with our communities. We will not be able to make informed decisions, whether we are policymakers, community leaders, or individuals who are concerned about climate. And therefore, going again behind what we see on the surface, laws and rights to information and so on, we need to ask what's actually happening. And then we need to hold companies as well as governments to account on ensuring that they provide access to everyone. There is a goal that was set by member states of the United Nations, by the international community, to provide universal access to the internet by 2023. It hasn't happened. Abysmal failure there. So I account to hold companies to account and ensure they don't leave behind the 3 billion people in this world.
Thank you very much, Irene. I think you have stressed a lot, like the responsibility of the governments to make companies accountable, and you have highlighted how the right to information is also tied to the right to infrastructures and also the right to have access to education. And here I would like to ask you, Vilas, the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation focuses on creating more equitable social structures through and around the use of data and AI solution. How can this help us understand the intersection between data systems and human equity, and how communities can transform their impact through data?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I want to start by following a thread that Irene spoke to, which is it's so often easy to think of data as a collection of numbers or a representation of some abstract reality. But to be represented in data is to be able to tell the story of your own experience, your identity, your political participation. A representation in data is a representation of your digital dignity. And so we need to start from the sense that even before we begin to think about how data is being used in predatory ways or ways that exploit vulnerability, the first core bedrock principle should be equitable representation in data. And in order to make that happen, the starting point should never be the private sector. It should be governments, civil society, and communities coming forward to demand just representation in the data. I think if we begin to think of that as the starting point, then we have a new journey to take with how we think about data systems, and hopefully the predictive analytics and the artificial intelligence that one day we might build on them. To think of data free from bias, to be fair, to be clear in representation. I'll give you a clear example. We see often the commercial sector entering into new ways of thinking about data to spur agricultural productivity, to think about large commercial farms and how they might better use local resources, often in highly extractive and predatory ways. And yet there's another side to that coin. When we equip local sustenance farmers with better information about weather systems, about local markets, and about pricing for their products, they're able to drive better economic stories for their own families. And that's work that only happens when we begin to think about sourcing data from and with communities, when we're thinking about ensuring that communities are economic participants in the value that's derived from that data, and we ensure that we have an ethical framework in which to build those data systems. Now, this work is obviously, an ideology around fairness and justice, but it also has very significant practical implications. One of the things that we recognize as necessary in the world is a new mechanism to share data between communities, to remove private sector organizations as the collectors, aggregators, and intermediaries, and rather to say, as we produce data that reflects our world, we should also be the ones who own it. And so I think the call here from the Patrick McGovern Foundation and from civil society at large should be to create new civil sector capacity to aggregate data and to be able to share it back to the world. We've started some of this work in thinking about climate data, in thinking about how we are able to tie together the amazing human ingenuity that leads to geospatial intelligence and highly granular information about carbon emissions, but connecting that back to the stories of indigenous earth defenders, of citizens in cities who are seeing how climate effects are affecting their lives, of how farmers are seeing local climatic effects, and how urban city dwellers are experiencing air pollution that is more than the quantification of the number of parts per million that has direct effects on their ability to breathe. So this project and this process we're now seeing in multiple places. Some of the work that we're doing with the United Nations and a number of private partners on DISHA, a new global collection environment for data that allows us to drive better humanitarian responses. With the World Economic Forum and a new partnership called Gaia that brings together philanthropies, governments, and private sector. And of course, the incredible leadership of people like Amandeep Gill, the UN Secretary General's tech envoy, and Gabriela Ramos, the Deputy Director of UNESCO, who are driving ethical frameworks for the application of data and artificial intelligence all around the world. But at the end of the day, this story, even as we build new frameworks and infrastructure, has to be about empowering communities as leaders, owners, and shapers of their own data destinies. We think often that we can't build these tools without understanding frontline local knowledge, without recognizing that the problems that data infrastructure might solve are best understood by those who experience it, not necessarily by those who created the problems to begin with. That until we can make sure that tools are grounded in and co-created with these communities, they'll be fueled by an experience that doesn't reflect the kind of equitable path that we hope societies are on. And finally, we need to ensure that when we deploy data and AI solutions at the front lines of vulnerability, that we don't simply push a product out into the world and walk away. That we recognize that this is a journey towards justice, and that requires both technology creators and communities to work in lockstep, to understand that the tools we build need to be maintained, iterated, and built for a long-term future.
Thank you very much. I believe that we need, of course, to support alternative data governance models, because that's part of, again, having the conditions to access, for example, to information, to the information that is produced from us, by us. And also, for example, if we explore alternative data governance models in communities that are defending their lands to fight against the climate crisis, that could also help, of course, the capacity of the communities to fight back to these trends. Irene, going back to the idea of the risk that activists face, how do we address the deliberate targeting of climate activists through attacks and surveillance, the use of technology, and I would say also the use of data against land defenders and activists, especially in the territories of the Global South?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, because I see myself frozen on the screen. But as long as you can hear me, I will continue. Thank you so much for raising the issue of the activists. those people who are on the front lines, giving attention to them. Unfortunately, the region from where you are speaking now, in Costa Rica, the Latin America, Central American region, is the highest in the world for killings of activists, environmental activists, and most activists, more than half of the activists who were killed last year were actually related in one way or the other to climate and environmental issues. So this is a real problem. Now, there I would say that there are a couple of things that need to be done. First of all, we are finding that surveillance, digital surveillance, is increasing of activists, both by states, but also at times by companies. And it's extremely important that this whole area of digital surveillance, particularly intrusive digital surveillance of this kind that we've seen, for example, with the Pegasus project of NSO, be banned. We need to ban them. We need to put an immediate moratorium and then put in place some proper regulatory mechanisms, oversight of any kind of surveillance that's taking place. You know, judicial oversight is very important because that kind of freezes activism. It freezes activities and information. Vilas talked about data, but the important thing and the reason why alongside data we also need privacy is because privacy allows us to speak freely, to act freely. So I think here surveillance is a big threat to activism on climate issues. There is also the issue of protests being not tolerated. Governments seem to believe that protest is some form of legitimate peaceful process, is some form of attack on the government. And there are just too many situations where protesters, whether they are school children or whether they are indigenous leaders, are attacked and sometimes even killed. And therefore, I think we need to strengthen the laws that allow us to express our views. We need to hold governments to account for that. And I would say that one interesting development in this area has been the Escazú agreement that I mentioned earlier. The Escazú agreement actually recognizes the right of environmental rights defenders as a category. They have legal rights, they have the right to participate, they have the right to be heard, they have the right to protest and criticize. And that changes the narrative of who is protesting. Because many of these attacks take place because somehow protesters, whether they are indigenous leaders who are trying to protect their own land or whether they are school children who don't want to lead their lives in a world where the planet is being destroyed, you know, they are seen as some kind of aberration of society. But that narrative is changed when they are recognized as having legitimate voice and being able and given the chance to put their voice across. So I think controlling surveillance, strengthening the laws for people to debate, to criticize, to protest if they want to, and recognizing that this is actually a very important part of the way in which you change society. You put new issues on the agenda, you build awareness of the problems. I think that is how we have to do. Some of it is law, some of it is technology, but some of it is about society itself, recognizing the role it plays in bringing about change through activism.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I come from Mexico, and unfortunately in Mexico, land defenders, human rights activists, and journalists are the first targets of surveillance. And yeah, that's still something that we need to address like urgently in our countries. Vilas, many institutions exist to protect and advance human equity. Are they doing a good job? What do you suggest in terms of strengthening existing institutions?
Oh, Paula, this is where I get myself into trouble. But let me answer your question very directly. I think our institutions are failing us. I think there's an increasing crest of vulnerability around us. And in many ways, we are still stuck in ways of doing business and intervention that feel like they were created for a different century and a different time. A few examples. I mean, I think about what happened after the violent incursion of Russia into Ukraine, and the responses that were driven on even as basic needs as getting food supplies and response into the country. And what we saw was small organizations using innovative tactics and tools like the World Central Kitchen, who were able to come in and immediately address the traumatic needs of traumatized peoples by providing them food, comfort, and shelter, even as some of our multilateral, large-scale institutions that get the vast majority of funding took far longer to even enter the arena. So particularly when it comes to climate change, when it comes to a sense that we need a new generation of solutions that follow the learnings and wisdom of equity and community-centered design, but require a new technical capacity to deliver meaningful solutions, I think we need a reinvention of our institutions. We need to acknowledge and continue to center the idea that public trust should be what drives the activities of these organizations, but that their structures don't need to be wedded to the ways that they have always worked. That a new form of agility, of participatory design and participatory action, of working with communities to build solutions can give us a new toolkit for the future. I think about fundamental questions like the ones Irene raised. Surveillance, a significant challenge for activists across the world. And as you noted, Paula, particularly for land defenders, for earth defenders, and for those at the front lines of the climate fight. And I think about those individuals and I ask, where do they go for support and succor as they think about defending themselves from these kinds of interventions? Well, I think the answer is in a new ecosystem of civil society players, groups like the Cyber Peace Institute, that are working to build new solutions that allow for individual activists to have cybersecurity, to be able to use tools that are built directly for them to protect them from predatory surveillance. I think about technology institutions that are stepping forward to build the kinds of GIS-enabled tools that allow an Earth defender on the front lines to better figure out where they should be spending their time to interrupt illegal poaching or illegal logging activities with groups like Digital Democracy. That we need a new set of civil society institutions that are tech-enabled, but are still grounded in the core principles of both humanitarian law and human rights, is, I think, the place where we need to focus our efforts as we think about what a next generation of institutions look like. I'll give you a specific example. I think we know and recognize broadly that artificial intelligence has become the flavor of the moment, right? Every conversation seems to revolve around it. And yet we know that the vast majority of investment into artificial intelligence tools is primarily coming out of the private sector and is being used to buttress and support the same kinds of predatory action that have typified the last 7 decades. Fossil fuel extraction with more efficient GIS mapping and more efficient supply chain. Better exploitation of the workforce, right? To have more efficiencies and more optimization. And yet the amount of investment that's going into civil society, into institutions that are trying to build artificially intelligent solutions that play the other side of the coin, that support workers' rights, that support the political freedoms of activists, that support our ability to convene and engage, is a tiny, tiny portion of the global investment. We're missing all of these critical voices, from indigenous communities to women and girls, as we've talked about. And maybe in the starkest moment of reality, we see that 80% of the AI-based solutions that were even created to support the SDGs were built in the global north, not in the global majority. So how do we bridge this fundamental gap and shift this dynamic? Well, I think it comes back to institutions. It comes back to investing in building capacity to use and develop these tools inside of communities. It looks at identifying new methodologies and interventions around climate mitigation that are owned by and centered by frontline defenders, from thinking about new ways to do eco-friendly routing of supply chains, to using solar energy collection data to forecast the use of fossil fuels and ensure that communities can be participants and owners of the right physical infrastructure that lets them economically participate in the clean transition. And finally, I'll say, it requires a new conception of who supports this creation of new institutions. It's classically been a government function, right? Governments coming together in multilateral ways to build new multilateral institutions that have global mandates. And yet we're recognizing that political power and technological power, twinned as they are in the transition era that we're in, should be grounded in much smaller political units of identity. And that means that we need a robust civil society and philanthropic action that thinks about how to build, source, and create this capacity in partnership with local communities. It's not about capital. It's not about technological prowess. It's about ensuring that we're creating a movement of actors that are aligned around the sense that these tools can be used to bend the arc of progress towards justice. And that's the work that I think we need to envision as we think about the future of institutions.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring. And of course, I absolutely agree that we need more investment to develop our own technologies and of course, empower communities to have the right to infrastructure, to develop their own infrastructures. I would like to ask you, we have still time for some questions from the audience. If you have questions or comments, please send them to our special guests. I would like to ask a final question regarding the risk that the land defenders are facing when they are opposed to the extractive industries that are necessary for technological development. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Of course, I'm happy to jump in. That there exists an asymmetry of power between those who protect justice and those who predate on it is not a new thing, right? That is the classical construction and why we need humanitarian and human rights interventions. Will it continue? Unfortunately, we think yes. We think that a world in which technology is primarily owned by those who hold power and use it to promote inequality just continues to center the necessity of these human rights defenders and activists. And it's a story not just of power, it's a story of bravery and a story of courage. But where we find hope is in the idea that these new technologies might provide us with interventions that allow us to chip away at that asymmetry, that allow us to bring all of the things that we know to be powerful and just, collective action, for example, and use technology to shape those opportunities for aligned purpose and aligned activities inside of more efficient mechanisms of deploying that action out to the world. I think, for example, about work that we have supported with Indigenous communities across the world, to align on the fact that even though they often operate in incredibly fragmented legal jurisdictions, in highly fragmented local environments with a vast array of political and economic adversaries, that a fundamental recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples as contained in UN DRIP, but as contained in the living practice of these communities, allows us to create new collective action and speak in louder voices, to seek both public attention, to seek justice and judicial process, and to align our activities in ways that allow us to reshape the asymmetry of power. So we think technology can help with this. It's never a panacea. But if we can think of ways of building these tools in ways that allow small communities to band together, to raise and shape new ways of intervening, then I think there's a possibility that we're able to chip away with this in the short term, certainly, but I think much more importantly, over a longer generational timescale.
Thank you very much. Irene, you mentioned before the responsibility of the governments and, of course, the responsibility of companies to address this climate emergency. But here we are a community of civil society, human rights defenders, land defenders, activists, academics. What's our responsibility? What would you tell us to this community that is gathered here today to think together on ways to move forward our digital rights agenda and human rights agenda, the right to information and the right to infrastructures as well?
Well, thank you very much for that good question, because as Vilas was talking about institutions, I was thinking, yes, institutions are important. The other side, of course, are the individuals who work in the institutions, the individuals who work in society, the individuals who are us, effectively us, that you were talking about. And our responsibility, of course, is enormous here, especially when it comes to an issue like climate change. The planet does not belong to business or to governments. The planet belongs to all of us, and we need all to therefore be aware, claim our rights, and take our responsibilities very seriously in that context. And I would say that there are a couple of things. We've touched upon it, we've mentioned it, Vilas certainly mentioned it. I want to raise again, one is investing in digital literacy. And I emphasize literacy. We're not talking about digital skills, so that we know what we have there, not just that we know how to work with a computer or with a smartphone. The second is actually equal opportunities. I think civil society, individuals, activists, we have a greater sense because we are closer to the people, and we are part of the communities ourselves, that we have the strong sense of understanding who is being left behind. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that those people are not left behind. And that is where activism comes in, that is where organization comes in, that is where solidarity comes in. And my last point would be solidarity across borders. I think we are living in a world where new inequalities are being created by technology. But technology doesn't actually create the inequalities. What creates it is the policies, the way in which either the business leaders or political leaders or other leaders are using those resources. And we need to recognize that if one thing technology has done, it has in many cases wiped out borders. We can communicate. Here I am sitting in Europe. I don't know where Vilas is, and you are there in Costa Rica, and we are having this conversation. So that just shows borders have become meaningless. But when borders become meaningless, then international solidarity has to become even stronger, because what I do here will affect where you are, and similarly the other way around. And that is where I think we as activists at RightsCon have to take our responsibility very seriously of working together to build a world that is truly just and fair. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your inspiring words. We have one question from the audience. It says, could you say more about how you are working to amplify the voices and work of environmental defenders beyond just superficial engagement and consultations?
Of course. Who would you like to have answer, Paula?
Oh, any of you. It doesn't say whom is the question addressed to, so please feel free to jump in.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to go first. You know, I think it's exactly the right question, right? Too much of what happens, I think, is that level of superficial engagement. For us, this has become a core body of work where we think about investing with and in partnerships that bring community decision makers to the table around building new climate tools. So everything from organizations like Climate Trace that are working with communities across the planet to provide really granular understanding of the carbon effects of decisions that are being made in their communities, to work that I mentioned earlier where we're working with groups like Digital Democracy to invest in creating tools that center frontline earth defenders in their fight against illegal poaching and logging. And finally, to thinking about organizations like Technovation, which I've not had a chance to speak about today, that are working across the planet to build exactly those kinds of both basic digital literacy skills that Irene focused on, but also to help women and girls have access to the kinds of educational training that lets them become not merely participants in, but architects of new technological solutions. Now, everything I've shared so far has been about the kind of opportunity of technological transformation and how it intersects with community design. But underlying that goes back to where I started my remarks, a comment about digital dignity as a representation of true human dignity in the world. That these tools are really about restructuring conversations, ensuring that communities and individuals have a clear voice in the kinds of policies that need to be enacted to change the state of the world around us. Technology is never a panacea. I've said this several times in it. And where I'm optimistic about the fact that if we made good decisions, we could build good technologies, that's not a default. But where I have an unshakable conviction is that individuals and communities coming together to advocate for themselves can shape a more just policy environment that lets us then address all of the consequences of some of these good and bad actions.
Thank you very much. We have 30 seconds left. Irene, your final words?
Well, my final word is that I think you have here, in this discussion, you have captured possibly the most important issue, existential question that we have today, and that is about the existence of the planet, and the other side of it, what will human beings do about it? So, I think that's basically what we've been grappling with. And it's very, very important here that technology serves our purpose and not the other way around. Technology is not the solution. Technology is a means to a solution. The solution has to be defined by human beings with the interests of human rights out there. Principle of equality, of non-discrimination, of just reparations. These are all issues that we have to think about when we talk about justice. And I think we need to have other players here, but civil society and individuals, as activists, we have to put our conscience on the line and fight for what we believe in.
Irene Villas, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and visions with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Irene.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Beth Alexion, and I'm joining you from